A few years ago, a family friend of ours was walking home from his job as a nurse at the local hospital after a late night shift. And between the hospital and home, he was jumped by three blokes in the street who beat him up viciously, robbed him of everything he had, and effectively left him for dead. In fact, they left him with life-changing injuries, and he never worked since. Now, when that happened, I remember his friends, like myself, family members, our reaction, our instinctive reaction was just this real sense of, how can this be possible? How could this happen on the streets of London? How can injustice like this happen in today's world? Notice the response we'd reached for. We didn't reach for explanations like, well, this is just the survival of the fittest, or, these things just happen. But the instinctive answer that bubbled up when our friend suffered that crime was, this is unjust, this is not right, something should be different. And I find it fascinating, that desire for justice, that sense that justice is right and injustice is wrong, bubbles up whenever we come across situations like that, whether it happens to ourselves or to a loved one, or we turn on the TV and we see, what's going on in Ukraine or George Floyd or whatever it is. That response we have, that desire for justice, is universal. Interestingly, of course, it also is all over our movies. The majority of movies, there's some dystopian fiction out there that plays with this, but most movies are constructed along that narrative arc, aren't they? You've got the good guy or girl and his or her posse, you've got the bad guy, most superhero movies, for example, are structured this way, and then there's some climactic battle, there's some terrible injustice, but ultimately, good overcomes evil, justice wins out, and we leave the cinema thinking, yes, that's how it should be. But of course, then we step out into the real world, and life isn't that simple. There is injustice everywhere. But if injustice does seem to be so universal, death and destruction and decay and pandemics and Putin and goodness knows whatever, where does this universal longing for justice come from? But there's another side to this question too, isn't there? Which is, whenever we think about justice and injustice, of course, we naturally tend to put ourselves on the side of the justice group. We're always part of the guys who've been wronged, we're always the ones who are right, and it's those people over there. If we could just sort that lot out, we bring justice to the world. Why do we also have this tendency, while we're very quick to see the injustice outside, we don't tend to notice the injustice in ourselves? Now, what is the best story? What's the best explanation of reality that describes those two things, both our longing for justice and the blind spot we have when it comes to our own injustice? Well, of course, if we live in a wholly godless universe where the only things in existence are atoms and particles and the blind, deterministic laws of physics and biology and chemistry, then that longing for justice we have is wildly, wildly off-beam. It's just random. It's just evolution playing a trick on us, because this isn't a just universe. Ultimately, the strong flourish and the weak get trodden on, and that is just the way of the world. On the other hand, if the Christian story is true, then the Bible tells us that God did create this universe designed for justice and goodness. Love is the ultimate virtue at the heart of the universe. And yes, something has gone wrong in God's good creation, and the Bible tells that story too, but the reason we long for justice is we were made for justice. But the Bible says something else as well. The Bible also addresses that tendency we have in ourselves to ignore the injustice that we're guilty of and only focus on others. Jesus talked a lot about this. And one of the things I find fascinating about the Bible is, yes, it gives us this bigger story that explains why we long for justice, but it also identifies and calls out those things in our own hearts and our own lives that need dealing with, but doesn't leave it there, because also the Bible tells this story of how there is forgiveness possible, how God both calls out and names the injustice that we're guilty of, but also offers us, through Jesus, a way back. Have you ever wondered why we long for justice, why it matters to us? If you have, then give the Bible, give the Christian story, give Jesus a closer look, because I would argue that is the best explanation for that longing we find in all of us.